The morning of December 26th, 1996 began the way most mornings do in a wealthy Colorado neighborhood. Quietly, peacefully, blanketed in the soft silence that follows Christmas. Snow had dusted the streets of Boulder overnight. The lights from the previous evening's celebrations were still glowing in windows along 15th Street, and the whole city carried that drowsy, satisfied feeling that only comes in the hours after a holiday. Inside the Ramsey house, that quiet was about to be shattered in a way that would echo across the entire world for the next 3 decades and counting. What happened inside those walls on that frigid December morning would become one of the most scrutinized, most debated, most haunting unsolved murders in American history. A 6-year-old girl was dead. Her killer was never found. And what came next was something no family, no city, and no country was prepared for. Before we go any further, I want you to pause for just a moment and think about that. A child, 6 years old, days after Christmas, in her own home, was murdered. And in almost 30 years of investigations, thousands of interviews, and millions of dollars spent, not a single person has ever been charged. Not one. The case that you are about to hear is not just a murder mystery. It is a story of institutional failure, of a media machine that consumed an innocent family, of evidence mishandled and suspects overlooked, and of a father who is still alive today, still fighting for his daughter's justice, still whispering her name into a world that has never stopped listening. Stay with me, because this is the story of JonBenét Ramsey. And before this video is over, you are going to understand exactly why it still keeps investigators awake at night. To understand what happened to JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, you first have to understand the world she was born into. She came into this world on August 6, 1990, in Atlanta, Georgia, the daughter of JonBenét Ramsey and Patricia Ann Ramsey, known to everyone who loved her as Patsy. John Ramsey was not an ordinary man by any measure. He had built a technology company called Access Graphics from the ground up, and by the mid-1990s, that company had grown into a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin with revenues exceeding $1 billion annually. In Boulder, Colorado, where the family had relocated, the Ramseys were by any definition among the elite. They lived in a stunning Tudor-style home on 15th Street, a house with 15 rooms, a wine cellar, a butler's kitchen, and a basement that most families could only dream of. They were the kind of family that Christmas cards were made for. JonBenét herself was a golden-haired, bright-eyed little girl with a smile that could light up an entire room. She adored her parents, she adored her 9-year-old brother Burke, and she adored the pageant circuit that Patsy had introduced her to. Now, it is important that we address the pageant world honestly and without sensationalism, because it would later become one of the most distorted parts of this story. JonBenét had competed in and won several child beauty pageants, including Little Miss Colorado and America's Royale Miss. She wore full makeup and elaborate costumes during competitions, and the footage that would later surface of those pageants would be played on a loop by television networks hungry for something shocking. But people who knew JonBenét described a child who genuinely loved performing. She was joyful, she was funny, she was a little girl who also loved to ride her bike and play with her dog and argue with her big brother like any child would. The Ramsey family had faced tragedy before JonBenét's death. John had a daughter from a previous marriage, Elizabeth, who died in a car accident in 1992 at the age of 22. That loss had left a scar on the family that never fully healed. Patsy herself had been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer in 1993 and had fought back from what doctors initially told her was almost certainly a terminal illness. She had beaten it, or at least she had pushed it far enough back to live, to raise her children, to decorate that enormous house for Christmas, to tuck JonBenét in on the night of December 25, 1996. The Ramseys were a family who had already survived more pain than most. What was coming next was something that no amount of resilience could have prepared them for. Christmas Day, 1996, was a family celebration. The Ramseys had attended a Christmas party at the home of their friends, the Whites, Fleet and Priscilla White, in the late afternoon and evening. JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car on the way home, which was entirely typical for a 6-year-old who had spent the day in a frenzy of gifts and excitement. John carried her upstairs to her bedroom and tucked her in. Patsy helped Burke get settled. The house fell quiet. The family drifted to sleep in their beds, warm and together. It was the last ordinary night the Ramsey family would ever have. Before the sun was fully up the following morning, everything they had built, their reputation, their privacy, their sense of safety, their very lives as they knew them, would be gone. Patsy Ramsey woke up early on December 26th. She was already dressed and on her way downstairs when she found something on the spiral staircase that stopped her cold. There, spread across 3 pages of white paper in a careful, deliberate hand, was a ransom note. It was addressed to John. It claimed to be from a group who referred to themselves as a small foreign faction. It demanded $118,000, precisely the amount of John Ramsey's recent bonus from Access Graphics, a detail that would later send chills through investigators, for the safe return of JonBenét. It warned them not to call the police. It warned them not to contact anyone. It said that if they did, their daughter would be beheaded. Patsy Ramsey called 911 at 5:52 in the morning. Her first words to the operator were, "We have a kidnapping." What happened in the hours that followed is one of the most catastrophic failures in the history of American law enforcement, and it begins with a decision made in those first frantic minutes. When Boulder police officers arrived at the house, they did what seemed natural in the context of a kidnapping. They focused on the family, they waited for a phone call from the kidnappers, and they allowed the Ramseys to invite friends and neighbors into the house. In the span of a few hours, the crime scene, if it was indeed a crime scene, was contaminated by an unknown number of people walking through rooms, touching surfaces, and disrupting what should have been a carefully sealed and preserved forensic environment. No one knew yet that this would matter. No one knew yet that there would be no call from kidnappers. No one knew yet that JonBenét had never left that house at all. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Boulder detective Linda Arndt asked John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White to search the house for anything that seemed out of place. It was John Ramsey who opened the door to the basement wine cellar, a small, dark room in the far corner of the lower level of the home. What he found inside that room is something that no parent should ever have to see. JonBenét was there. She was lying on the floor, her arms raised above her head, a white blanket wrapped around her. Her mouth was covered with duct tape. Her wrists were bound with a length of cord. A nylon cord had been fashioned around her neck with a handle, a garrote, and it had killed her. John Ramsey lifted his daughter's body and carried her upstairs, crying out in grief, and in doing so, he moved the body from the crime scene before investigators could document it in place. The medical examiner would later determine that JonBenét had died from asphyxia due to strangulation, combined with a severe blunt force trauma to the head. The skull fracture she had sustained was catastrophic, an 8.5-inch fracture to the right side of her skull. She had also been sexually assaulted. She had been dead, the examiner estimated, for somewhere between 6 and 12 hours before her body was discovered, meaning she had almost certainly died late on the night of December 25th or in the very early hours of December 26th, while her family slept in their beds above her. Whoever had done this to her had been inside that house while the Ramseys were home. Whether they had entered from outside or whether they had never left at all was a question that would divide investigators, experts, and the public for the next 30 decades. Before we go any further into the investigation itself, I want to stop and talk about something that I think you deserve to understand fully: the physical evidence that was recovered from that house. Because this case is so often discussed in terms of theories and personalities and competing narratives, people sometimes forget that there is actual hard forensic evidence sitting at the center of it, and it tells a story that is both critical and maddeningly incomplete. The most important piece of evidence, the piece that has never been fully explained to this day, is a microscopic trace of DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. Specifically, male DNA was found in the waistband of her underwear and under her fingernails. It did not belong to anyone in the Ramsey family. It did not match John Ramsey. It did not match Burke Ramsey. It did not match any family member or any known person connected to the case. And if you're watching this and wondering whether that DNA is simply the result of contamination from the manufacturing process of her clothing, investigators have considered that. Experts have debated it. But former FBI profiler Candice DeLong and others have pointed out that the same unidentified male DNA profile appeared consistently in multiple locations, not just on one item, but on several separate surfaces associated with JonBenét's body. That consistency is significant. It suggests that the DNA is not random contamination. It suggests it came from one person who was in contact with JonBenét. Former Adams County District Attorney Bob Grant, who spent years assisting the investigation, has stated plainly that any resolution of this case will have to explain how that DNA got there. As of December 2025, that DNA still does not match any profile in any law enforcement database. Whoever it belongs to has never been identified. Beyond the DNA, there are other pieces of evidence that haunt this case. The ransom note itself is extraordinary in several respects. At 2.5 pages, roughly 538 words, it is one of the longest ransom notes ever written in connection with a kidnapping or murder. Handwriting analysts have examined it extensively. The note was written with a pen and a notepad found inside the Ramsey home, which means that whoever wrote it either brought their own materials and then used the Ramseys instead, or they wrote the note while already inside the house. The fact that the notepad and pen were found in the home and matched the note raised an immediate and chilling question. Did the killer spend time inside that house before the murder, composing a note at the kitchen counter or some other surface while the family was home? Or did someone in the family write that note? Both possibilities were investigated. Neither was conclusively eliminated. There was also a cord and a paintbrush handle used to construct the garrote around JonBenét's neck. The paintbrush was identified as belonging to Patsy Ramsey's art supplies. That detail was seized upon by early investigators as an indication of family involvement, because who else would know where Patsy kept her paintbrushes? But the counter-argument is equally valid. An intruder who had access to the house and time to prepare could have found those supplies just as easily. A rope was also found in a bedroom near JonBenét's room. The Ramseys said it was not theirs and they had no idea where it came from. No fingerprints were found on the garrote or on the duct tape. No fingerprints were found in the wine cellar. There was a small broken window in the basement of the home, and investigators found a scuff mark on the wall below it that could have been consistent with someone climbing in, or could have been there for months. Now, I want to talk about you. Yes, you. If you've been watching true crime content for any length of time, you know that the first hours and days of a murder investigation are the most critical. Evidence is freshest. Witnesses remember things most clearly. The trail is warm. What happened in the investigation into JonBenét's murder in those first hours and days is, by nearly every expert's account, one of the most thoroughly botched initial investigations in modern American history. And it matters, because some of what was lost in those early hours may never be recovered. Take a second to drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It helps this channel more than you know, and we have more stories like this one coming. Boulder police at the time were not equipped for a crime of this magnitude. It was a relatively small department in a college town known more for its mountain biking trails and organic coffee shops than for homicide investigations. When the case broke, they made a series of decisions that experts have criticized ever since. They allowed civilians to move freely through the crime scene. They did not immediately seal the house. They failed to collect trace evidence from the areas around the broken basement window in the critical early window of the investigation. They lost crucial time, focusing almost exclusively on the Ramsey family rather than looking outward for an intruder. And they allowed a critical piece of the investigation, the search of the house, to be conducted by John Ramsey himself, rather than by trained officers working in a systematic, documented way. These were not small errors. These were errors that closed doors permanently. The relationship between Boulder Police and the Boulder County District Attorney's Office became openly adversarial within weeks of the murder, and that conflict would cripple the investigation for years. The police believed the Ramseys were involved. The DA's office was less certain. In 1999, a grand jury secretly voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death and accessory to first-degree murder after the fact. But then District Attorney Alex Hunter looked at the evidence and made a decision that stunned the public when it was finally revealed years later. He declined to sign the indictments. He concluded that the evidence was insufficient to secure a conviction. The Ramseys were not charged. But the indictment vote, which remained sealed for years, ensured that the shadow of suspicion over the family never fully lifted. Into this chaos stepped a man named Lou Smit, a legendary retired Colorado detective who had solved over 200 murders in his career. Smit was brought in to assist the DA's office, and from the very beginning he came to a conclusion that put him directly at odds with Boulder police. Smit believed with deep conviction and based on careful analysis of the physical evidence that an intruder had entered the Ramsey home and killed JonBenét. He spent years cataloging what he believed were signs of an outside perpetrator: the scuff mark below the broken basement window, the foreign DNA, the unusual nature of the ransom note, and a set of marks on JonBenét's body that he believed were consistent with the use of a stun gun device to incapacitate her. Lou Smit eventually resigned from the DA's office because he felt the investigation was heading in the wrong direction. He continued working the case independently until his death in 2010, convinced he was right. The official investigation lurched from one crisis to the next throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The media coverage was relentless and often irresponsible. Cable news networks ran wall-to-wall speculation about the Ramseys. Journalists camped outside their home. Talk show hosts openly speculated about their guilt. Patsy Ramsey, who was still battling cancer, found herself being described as a murderous stage mother who had killed her own daughter in a fit of rage over a bedwetting incident, a theory that had no forensic support but spread across the tabloid press like wildfire. John Ramsey, the successful businessman, was portrayed as cold and calculating, a man hiding something. Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old at the time of his sister's murder, was discussed openly as a potential suspect on national television while he was still a child. The family did not simply grieve, they were consumed.
Let's talk about the suspects, because over nearly 3 decades, this case has generated a list of persons of interest that is almost impossible to fully catalog. I'm going to take you through the most significant ones, because each one tells you something important about the nature of this case, and about how difficult it is to solve a murder when the crime scene has been compromised and the political climate around the investigation has made clear thinking almost impossible. Before I do, I want to ask you something. If you think you know who did this, if you have a theory, even a half-formed one, drop it in the comments right now. I want to hear from you. This case belongs to all of us who care about justice for a little girl who never got it. The first and most prominent suspects were always John and Patsy Ramsey themselves. The statistical reality, as FBI profiler Greg McCrary noted, is that in the homicide of a child, there is roughly a 12-to-1 probability that the killer is a family member or caregiver. The police pointed to the fact that there were no signs of forced entry into the home, that the ransom note was written with materials found inside the house, and that the demand for exactly $118,000, matching John's bonus, suggested inside knowledge. The theory most closely associated with the family did it camp was that JonBenét had been killed accidentally, possibly by someone who struck her during a moment of anger or punishment, and that the staged kidnapping scenario was constructed afterward to throw investigators off the trail. But this theory requires explaining the unknown male DNA, which has never been done to any expert's satisfaction. In 2006, a man named John Mark Carr emerged from what seemed like nowhere and confessed to killing JonBenét. Carr was a 41-year-old former teacher who had been communicating with a University of Colorado journalism professor in a series of deeply disturbing emails about JonBenét. He was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand, and flown back to Colorado amid an extraordinary media circus. He claimed he had been with JonBenét on the night she died. He claimed her death had been an accident. He claimed to have loved her. The world watched, transfixed, certain this was finally the answer. It wasn't.
DNA testing conclusively ruled Carr out. His DNA did not match the profile found on JonBenét's clothing. He was released without charge. It later became apparent that Carr was a deeply troubled individual who had constructed an elaborate fantasy around the case. The confession was false. The killer was still out there. Among the intruder theorists, one name has circulated for years with particular persistence, that of Gary Oliva, a convicted sex offender who was living in Boulder at the time of JonBenét's murder and who had a known history of preying on young children. In 2016, while serving time in prison for child pornography, Oliva was found in possession of a photograph of JonBenet hidden in his belongings. More disturbing still, letters he had written to a friend from prison purportedly contained what investigators interpreted as a near admission to the crime, though Oliva has never been formally charged in connection with JonBenét's death. The Boulder police have said they have investigated Oliva extensively. His DNA has reportedly been compared to the evidence DNA. The results of that comparison have never been made publicly known, which has fueled enormous speculation among true crime researchers and amateur investigators who follow this case closely. Other intruder theories have pointed to pageant world contacts, to household staff, to people who attended parties in the Ramsey home, and to various individuals who had access to the house in the weeks and months leading up to the murder. Investigator Lou Smith was particularly focused on the stun gun theory, the idea that an organized, premeditated perpetrator had come prepared with tools designed to incapacitate JonBenet quickly and silently while her family was in the house. The marks on her body that Smith identified as consistent with a stun gun were disputed by other forensic experts who said they could have been made by other means, but Smith went to his grave believing that an organized intruder had targeted the Ramsey family specifically, perhaps someone who had observed the household, who knew the layout of the home, who knew about John's bonus, and who had chosen Christmas night deliberately because the family would be tired and off guard.
I want to spend some dedicated time on the DNA in this case, because I believe it is the single most important thread in this entire story, and it deserves more careful attention than it usually gets. When the Boulder DA's office used touch DNA analysis in 2008, a relatively new technique at the time, they found that the unknown male DNA profile was present not just in one location, but in multiple places on JonBenét's clothing and her person. On the basis of this DNA evidence, District Attorney Mary Lacey formally and publicly exonerated the Ramsey family. She wrote a letter to John Ramsey, who by then had buried both his daughter and his wife, Patsy having died of ovarian cancer in June 2006, and told him that the DNA evidence cleared his family entirely. It was a stunning, historic moment. A family that had been tried in the court of public opinion for a decade was told officially that they were innocent. But not everyone agreed that the exoneration was appropriate. In 2015, former Boulder Police Chief Mark Beckner publicly stated that he disagreed with the decision to fully exonerate the Ramseys based solely on the touch DNA evidence. He argued that touch DNA can be deposited in any number of innocent ways: on clothing during manufacturing, during retail handling, during laundering. He maintained that the unknown DNA, while significant, did not by itself eliminate all other theories. Former DA's office investigator Gordon Coombs made a similar argument, that clearing someone based purely on the premise of touch DNA in a case where the crime scene was compromised from the start was an overreach. These are legitimate forensic arguments. They do not mean the Ramseys are guilty. They mean that the DNA alone cannot close every door in this case, and that its interpretation has been shaped as much by the political and emotional climate around the investigation as by the science itself. What everyone on every side of this case agrees on is this: that unknown male DNA profile is real. It is consistent across multiple samples, and finding the person it belongs to is the most direct path to solving this murder. In December 2024, as the Netflix documentary series brought the case back into global conversation, John Ramsey, now 80 years old, gave interviews calling specifically for the application of investigative genetic genealogy to the DNA evidence. This is the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, after decades of impunity. It works by uploading an unknown DNA profile to public ancestry databases and then tracing family connections backward through genealogical research to identify potential suspects. John Ramsey has been pleading for this technology to be applied to his daughter's case. As of December 2025, Boulder police have confirmed they are actively working with DNA experts and law enforcement partners around the country, but they have released no further details about what specifically is being tested or who is being investigated. The December 2025 update from the Boulder Police Department, the most recent available, confirmed that in the preceding year, detectives had conducted several new interviews based on incoming tips, had collected new evidence, and had retested existing evidence using the latest available DNA technology. Boulder Police Chief Stephen Redfern stated directly, "We are committed to following up on every lead, and we are continuing to work with DNA experts and our law enforcement partners around the country until this tragic case is solved." He called it, still after 29 years, an active, ongoing, top priority investigation. Over 21,000 tips have been received and processed since 1996. Investigators have traveled to 19 states and interviewed more than 1,000 individuals. The case file is among the largest ever compiled by a local police department, and still, the answer has not come.
I want to take a moment away from the forensics and the suspects and the timelines to talk about Patsy Ramsey specifically, because I think she deserves that. Patricia Ann Ramsey was 49 years old when she died of ovarian cancer on June 24, 2006, almost 10 years to the day after her daughter's murder. She spent those 10 years in a state of suffering that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. She had lost her child in the most violent and public way imaginable. She had been accused explicitly and implicitly in newspaper headlines and on television screens and in the whispered conversations of strangers of having killed that child herself. She had cooperated with investigators even as those investigators treated her like a criminal. She had fought her cancer while fighting for her daughter's memory. Patsy Ramsey maintained until the end of her life that she had nothing to do with JonBenét's death. She and John wrote a book, they gave interviews, they begged for the public's help in finding their daughter's killer. When the National Enquirer ran a headline declaring her guilty, she sued. When CBS aired a docuseries in 2016, 10 years after her death, suggesting that her son Burke was responsible, Burke sued and won a substantial settlement. Patsy died before she was formally exonerated. The letter from the DA's office clearing the Ramsey family was written 2 years after Patsy's death, addressed to John, who read it alone. One of the great unresolved griefs of this case is that Patsy Ramsey never lived to see her name officially cleared. She went to her grave under the shadow of a suspicion that the evidence did not support. Her daughter's killer was never found. She never got justice. Neither of them did. This is the part of the story where I want to talk to you directly, those of you who were old enough to remember when this case first broke, because many of you watching this are. You remember December 1996. You remember turning on the evening news and seeing that little golden-haired girl's face for the first time. You remember the way the story dominated the early weeks of 1997, the way it seemed impossible to avoid. You remember the pageant footage. You remember the debates about whether the Ramseys were grieving parents or cold-blooded killers. You remember the way this case made people angry and sad and suspicious in equal measure. For those of you who weren't alive or were very young when this happened, I want you to understand the scale of what this case meant to the culture of the late 1990s. This was not just a news story, it was a national obsession that lasted years. True crime as a genre owes a significant debt to JonBenét Ramsey. The coverage of this case, its mixture of wealth, beauty, childhood innocence, Christmas, and brutal violence, created a template for the kind of true crime storytelling that would explode in the years and decades that followed. It taught television networks that people would watch hours and hours of coverage about a single case if the case was emotionally compelling enough. It taught tabloid editors that a murder victim's image on a cover would sell millions of copies. It taught the public that they had opinions about specific cases and specific suspects, and that those opinions mattered, even when they were uninformed. Some of those lessons were not good ones. The media coverage of the Ramsey family is now widely cited as an example of how journalism, in the absence of confirmed facts, can destroy innocent people.
The coverage did real damage to real human beings. It should not be forgotten. As we sit here in 2026, JonBenét Ramsey would have been 35 years old. She would have grown up, gone to school, maybe fallen in love, maybe had children of her own. Instead, she is frozen forever at 6, frozen in those pageant photographs, frozen in the footage that every documentary plays, frozen in the memory of a city and a country that has never been able to let go of her. John Ramsey, who is now in his early 80s, has spent the last 3 decades of his life defined by a crime he did not commit and a justice system that failed his family at every critical turn. He has watched his wife die. He has watched his name be dragged through the mud. He has pleaded, publicly and privately, for investigators to use every tool available to find his daughter's killer. He has not given up. He says he never will. The Netflix documentary that aired in November 2024 brought a new generation of viewers into this case for the first time. Young people who were not yet born in 1996 found themselves captivated by the same questions that have haunted investigators for 3 decades. Who wrote that ransom note? Who built that garage? Who was in that basement? The documentary featured extensive new interviews with John Ramsey and reopened public debate about the investigative failures that may have let the killer walk free. It also highlighted the potential of investigative genetic genealogy, the same technology that has cracked some of the most baffling cold cases of the last decade, to finally answer the question that Boulder, Colorado has been living with for almost 30 years. The technology exists. The DNA exists. The will, as far as investigators have publicly stated, also exists. The question is whether it will be enough. What I find most haunting about this case, and I want to be honest with you about this, is not the mystery of who did it, as chilling as that mystery is. What haunts me most is the certainty that someone, somewhere, knows what happened in that basement on Christmas night. Someone built that garage. Someone wrote that note. Someone walked out of that house and has been living their life for 29 years, while JonBenét Ramsey never got to live hers. That person has had birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays. That person may have watched the news coverage. That person may have watched documentaries. That person, if they are still alive, may be watching true crime content on YouTube right now. Somewhere in the 21,000-plus tips that have poured into the Boulder Police Department, the answer may already exist, waiting to be connected, waiting to be seen. Justice for JonBenét is not yet impossible. It is just long overdue.
Let me close by laying out the questions that remain, because I think you deserve to leave this video with the full weight of what is still unknown and with an understanding of exactly where the investigation stands. First, whose DNA is on JonBenét's clothing? This is the central question of the entire case. Everything else flows from it. If investigators can use genetic genealogy to identify the person that DNA belongs to, this case may finally break open. If they cannot, if the person has no living relatives in any public database, or if the database returns too many possible matches to narrow down, the investigation will continue to stall. Second, who wrote the ransom note? Handwriting experts have examined it for decades. Some believe Patsy Ramsey wrote it. Others have said the comparison is inconclusive. The note has never been definitively matched to any individual. Third, how did the killer get into and out of that house? If it was an intruder, the broken basement window remains the most credible entry point, but no one was ever conclusively placed there. If it was someone already inside the house, the crime becomes almost incomprehensibly dark in its implications. Fourth, what was the motive? The ransom of $118,000, matching John's bonus, has always suggested someone with inside knowledge of the family's finances. Was it a targeted crime? Was it opportunistic? Was it personal? These questions have never been answered. And fifth, perhaps most important of all, after nearly 3 decades, after more than 21,000 tips and 1,000 interviews and investigations spanning 19 states, does the evidence still exist in a usable form? Has time done to the physical evidence what the botched early investigation began, eroding the only path to truth that was ever there?
JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her.
She had a father who loved her and a mother who fought cancer to stay alive for her. She had a brother who grew up in the shadow of what happened to her. She had a city that never forgot her, a country that never stopped asking questions, and a world that, nearly 30 years later, is still watching, still waiting, still hoping that somewhere in the silence, someone will finally speak. The investigation is still open. The Boulder Police Department has asked, again as recently as December 2025, for anyone with any information to come forward. If you know something, anything that might be relevant to this case, the email address is bouldersmostwanted@bouldercolorado.gov. The tip line is 303-414-1974. Justice has been a long time coming, but it has not yet been given up on. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, I ask you to do just one thing before you leave. Subscribe to the Untold True Crime Stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video, and drop a comment below and tell me what you think happened in that basement on Christmas night 1996. Tell me your theory. Tell me what the evidence says to you. Tell me where you're watching from, because this channel has viewers all over the world, and I love knowing where these stories are landing. This community exists because of you. JonBenét Ramsey deserves to be remembered, to be spoken of, and to have her story told by people who care about the truth. Thank you for watching. Stay with us. There are more stories in the dark, and we are going to tell every single one of them.